I am an intensive and obsessive listener, which is maybe not like I don't know if it's good or not. I will listen to like one album all day and then I can really understand it deeply. And I think that is also something I've kind of just made my peace with, is that I'm never going to be like extensive in terms of like my knowledge or interests or anything. Like, I'm an intensive person. Like, I just have passions about certain things, certain artists, and I just will like really go in there. So listening is like the most important thing for me in terms of like my creative practice, and I do it every day. I listen to something new.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hey there, folks. Tyler here. Really glad to have you along for the show today. And if you are tuning in for the very first time, just want to say welcome. This is a podcast where we talk to music makers and people who make other things to learn about their journey and process and so much more. And if you have been listening for a little while now, welcome back. Thanks so much for coming back for more. On today's episode of the podcast, you're in for a real treat, and you're also in for something completely different than I've presented in prior episodes, because today I'm joined by writer and experimental music critic Vanessa Ague. Vanessa Ague is a Brooklyn-based violinist and arts journalist who primarily writes about experimental, contemporary classical, and improvised music. She's written for The Wire, Bandcamp Daily, Pitchfork, The Quietus, The Brooklyn Rail, WNYC's New Sounds, WQXR, Texas Monthly, and Musicworks, among others. Since 2017, she's been running the blog The Road to Sound, where she covers experimental music and the artists who make it. She's particularly interested in guitars, drones, electronics, and the intersection of all three. I absolutely loved talking to Vanessa, and I think you're going to love this conversation too. In this discussion, we talk about everything from Hayao Miyazaki films to Radiohead albums, some of the inner workings of arts journalism, why curiosity is not just a good trait for music writers, but for literally everybody, and so much more. Just some business to share before we jump into this discussion. One of the simplest and really the best ways for you to support the podcast is by listening to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, and then giving us a follow on your favorite streaming platform. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released, pushed straight to your device. You can support what we're doing here and get early access to episodes by becoming a Patreon subscriber for just $5 a month. And yes, that little bit of support goes a long way in helping me cover the cost of some of the tools that I use to produce the podcast. And if an ongoing donation just isn't your thing, I've also got a one-time link along with that Patreon link on our website at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. You can also visit looseleaftransmissions.com/musicmaker to access a transcript of today's discussion, plus helpful links and other information related to the episode. And finally, an impactful and free way to help the Music Maker podcast is, again, to follow us on your favorite streaming app and leave that rating or review if you feel so inclined. That takes just a few moments, especially that click of a button with a rating. And the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more we are able to grow as not just a podcast, but an organization. All right, that's all I've got. On to my conversation with Vanessa Ague. I'm really excited to talk with you today because, what you and I do it's different, but it's also adjacent. And I'm excited to kind of get your insights on your side of the coin and kind of learn about your journey and process a little more. So thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really exciting. It's the best way to spend my Friday morning.
Oh, perfect. So, full disclosure, I'll say that you are my first non-composer interviews, but I'm going to kind of start in the same place that I normally do and kind of frame it a little bit differently. And that is, what is your earliest artistic memory? And I guess that would be as a writer, specifically an arts and music journalist, because I'm sure, you probably, wrote essays in elementary school and middle school and high school, and that's like a universal experience. So maybe
Yeah.
something more specific to what you do today.
Yeah. Well, so, it's been kind of an interesting road to get here as, an experimental music critic, which is kind of what I am. I guess that's probably the best definition of what I am. I think like anyone who gets into music, I have a lot of early memories with music specifically, but I would say like my first encounter with arts journalism and doing it myself was probably watching Spirited Away, because I saw that film when I was like 10. I've always been a big Miyazaki head. Like, I was really into Kiki's Delivery Service when I was little. And seeing Spirited Away, for whatever reason, really unlocked a lot of thoughts in me. Like, that film, while it is a children's film, has a lot of symbolism in it. There's a lot of discussion about greed. There's a lot of discussion about kind of like the West and all of those ideas that come up throughout Miyazaki's work. But when I was watching that film, it was like something unlocked in my brain. And I was like, oh, wait, I really kind of like analyzing the stuff I'm taking in. And I was really little. So it
Yeah,
was
sure.
very basic, but it was like I'm picking up on this symbolism and I'm really engaged by it. And then 4 years later, I was a freshman in high school, and my civics teacher put out this piece of art she made, and it was like, I don't even remember what it was. I think it was something like there were like villagers and there was like a river, and it was an extra credit assignment, like to write an essay about what you thought the piece of art was about and what it was saying and what its significance was. And so naturally, because I was an overachiever, I had to do it. Even though I had like an A in the class, I was like, I got to do the extra credit. But then when I was doing it, I had so much fun. And she ended up awarding it to me. I was the winner. And she gave me this little cat that has like a tall tail that you can like put rings on.
Oh, nice.
I don't know why, but that's like it's like a little wooden cat. And I think those were kind of like the earliest signs that I would probably end up somehow being into art analysis in a way more so than like creation. Although we could say that criticism is art in itself, but there is sort of like a different side of it. It's like responding to someone else's art.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I love that you brought up Miyazaki because that's Miyazaki's work also resonates with me quite a bit. Except, unlike you, I didn't encounter it until I was in my 30s. Like,
Wait, really?
yeah, like a few years ago was the first time I started with Spirited Away.
Okay,
I was
good
like, okay,
choice.
this is like I love anime, I love Japanese culture. This is a no-brainer. I need to watch these films, I should say. So I started at that place. It seemed natural. I loved it. And
Hmm.
then I watched My Neighbor Totoro, which
Hmm.
is very much a children's film, but was a blast to watch. And then I
Hmm.
watched Kiki's Delivery Service. I remember I watched it by myself, and I like cried in the middle of it.
Oh my god, it is such a moving film. And I'll say, and it's also huge for my older sister. Like, both of us really connected to that when we were growing up. And I think a huge reason why, too, for like a young girl to relate to it is just that it like centers and portrays the experience of like growing up as a young girl and like having
Sure.
insecurities, or like, feeling pressured about boys, like all of this sort of these ideas, and then like finding yourself, like all of these ideas are not necessarily centered in a lot of American like Disney
Oh, totally.
films.
Yeah.
So, right? What
Yeah.
part made you cry?
Yeah, I think all of it. It was just the whole thing to me. It was like an allegory for being being an artist, right? I mean, that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
literally touched on in the film, not to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen this like 30-plus-year-old film, but
So sorry.
there's like actually an artist character, and Kiki, I think, she loses her powers, and this artist kind of helps her. It's like a literal connection there. I
Ursula.
think that Miyazaki is trying to portray that, I've really had a tumultuous relationship with my own creative life, I guess I should say, as a composer, because, there's times where I feel like I lose my magic. I lose my
Mm-hmm.
magic, and I don't want to do it anymore, and I'm freaked out by that. And, I always come around to it. And I think seeing that portrayed through this story really moved me to a degree that Susanna was working on a piece of music at the time, and Susanna can get writer's block sometime. And I go upstairs after watching this movie, and I'm like, you have to watch this movie right now. And so the next day I watched it again with
Oh
her.
my God.
And like now I have like a Kiki tattoo. Like that's how important that movie is
Oh
to
my
me.
gosh.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I mean, and yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because a lot of Miyazaki's art is meta. And I've been talking a lot about The Boy and the Heron with people because I didn't love it. But that one also was kind of exploring like the death of the artist, or like, did my ideas do anything for the world? Which is kind of a sad thing, but like, it's interesting to talk about. With Kiki, I will also say Ursula. She is who I've modeled like my whole life after. She's
That's
like who
awesome.
I want to be.
Yeah.
Like when I was a kid, I saw her on screen and I was like, that is gonna be me. Like I want to be alone with my crows, drawing and inspiring young girls to like have confidence about their work. Like I was like, I have to be that. So that was also like a personal thing for me with Kiki. But I do think it's so interesting that all of these films, like they're kids' films, so you can take them totally at face value of like, oh, this is a fun story about a teenage witch. Or you can take it, it can be so personal where it's like really hits you in that moment of like, oh my gosh, this is about create my creative practice. And like, I really relate to Kiki, or relate to Kiki being like insecure, relate to Ursula being like cool. There's just so many layers to these films. And I think for me, that's why I always come back to them. And also why they unlocked so much in my head when I was so young, because there's just no other kids' films doing it like that.
Oh,
For real.
absolutely not.
Right?
When you were going through school, or even recently, have you ever written about these films in any way?
No, I have not. But I've written about, I did program notes for a Seattle Symphony Joe Hisaishi concert. But like, I haven't. It's been something that's personal to me. And almost like, I think something I think a lot about with criticism, and like maybe this is getting ahead of the conversation, but something I think a lot about with criticism is just like, is my voice adding anything? So a huge reason why I don't write about like any indie music is because I don't have much to say. I'm like, this is fine. And I think with Miyazaki, it's just been such like a personal experience that I don't even know if I have much to say about it other than how it makes me feel.
Yeah,
And so it's something I think about a lot.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think about that in terms of composing and performing as well. When I see people programming the same, Beethovens and Mozarts and all that kind of, it's like, what do we have to add to that no one else has?
Right.
Or even as a composer, especially, like, what can I do to contribute to this art form in a meaningful way? And if I can't answer that question, should I even bother?
Yep.
So I really appreciate that. You're one of only a handful of people that I feel like shares the same eclectic taste in music that I have. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've gone throughout my life kind of introducing people to music and not
Mm-hmm.
really being introduced to too much music from other people.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I see you like writing about and listening to a lot of music that it's like, oh, I've never met anybody who's actually like this the way that I do. So,
Mm-hmm.
when did you first notice that your taste in music was perhaps a little more eclectic than other people's.
Yeah. Honestly, doing this interview now, I'm realizing 14 was a year for me because it was when I was 14 that I think I had that realization. So when I was in high school, like a lot of my friends and I, we would like burn CDs from each other that we of like music we thought was cool. There's a record store in my hometown called Exile on Main Street, and there was a record store in New Haven called I think it was Cutler's. And like both of those spots were places that I would like go and like just buy CDs, a lot of stuff that I discovered on like Last FM. But one of the first things that my friend burned from me was her cousin had Radiohead's whole discography. And she was like, I think you would like Radiohead. And at this point in my life, I was not, to be clear, like when I was in middle school, I did not listen to any like mainstream music. All I listened to was like classical and contemporary classical. That's it. And it was in a huge part to kind of differentiate myself from other people. I've always been like a super contrarian. So I just was like,
Yeah.
I don't want to listen to Blink 182. Like, y'all are listening to it. Forget about it, you know?
Yeah.
I'm going to listen to Bach. And I was also playing violin. So, you know, there was kind of a natural feeling that like classical was what I should be taking in. But, you know, my friend was like, I think you really like Radiohead. Like, my cousin's really into them. And so her cousin burned me this CD that had their entire discography, like a bunch of random EPs and stuff too. Like, it had In Rainbow's Disc 2. Like, this person had it all. Like, and, and to this day, those are still the files I have in my
Oh, that's awesome.
library. But, you know, the first album I listened to was Kid A. And I remember really connecting with that album immediately. And more importantly, my dad, I had like I think it was an iPod Classic at the time. And my dad saw my screen for what I was listening to. And he said to me, he was like, oh, so you like the weird stuff? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what that means. But he was right, you know, he was totally right. And then it just kind of, I think, connecting with Kid A and Amnesiac, like both
Oh
of
yeah.
those albums simultaneously from that discography, really is what kind of sent me down the path of checking out other more sort of, I guess, mainstream, but like alternative or like experimental rock. And so that's how I knew. It was my dad saying, oh, you like the weird
You
stuff.
like the Yeah, it's funny because Radiohead doesn't seem too weird to me now, but at one point in high school, I bought a record player. I should say that the record player, like embarrassingly, I should admit, I guess I'll say, the record player was one of those like 3-in-1 CD tape, but it like had that old timey look to it. So
Yep.
picture that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the girl I was dating in high school, for whatever reason, I guess maybe I had torrented some Radiohead or something. Like I think
Yeah.
I'd gotten into Radiohead, and this girl I was dating bought me my first kind of brand new record, not a used record, not an old record. It was a
Yeah.
new, I think, 10-inch edition of Amnesiac, and
Incredible.
that became my favorite. It still is my favorite Radiohead record. I think probably for
It's
that
the
reason,
best.
but just the opening moments of that album, like the percussive quality to it, it's just like something like opened up inside of me when I put that on. Hearing it on a record, I don't know. I'm totally with you though.
That album is kind of absurd that it even got put out because it's not cohesive, like in any shape or like at all. And it sounds that we don't hear anywhere else in Radiohead's catalog. Like all of the static noise and stuff, like that's nowhere else. And there's something so interesting to me about the fact that they were doing that and Kid A at the same time, like completely different worlds. And like the one thing that I love the most about Amnesiac is that they just went for it and put Life in a Glass House as the closer. What? What? It's so good. And That's also my favorite Radiohead album. I think the reason I listened to Kid A first was that I was drawn to the cover. Like, I thought the cover was really interesting, so I was like, I'll pull this one out. Amnesiac's cover is kind of scary. Like, to me,
Yeah,
there's something, right? It's like a
it's
little
dark.
alarming. It's
Yeah.
dark. So I was like, oh, I'm not touching that.
Now that we're talking about it, it's almost like a Rothko painting.
It is, but then there's kind of like that Tom Yorkie, like, center. Is it their logo in the center? I can't quite remember.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but yeah, you're right, it's dark, and I love it for that reason.
No, I know. It's like a siren blaring at you. And I love it too, and I really connect with it. And I think that's one of those albums, like, there's just a few albums or like a few artists that I feel like people who kind of get into this sort of eclectic listening really connect with. I think Amnesiac and Kid A are two of the classics. And then for me, honestly, what kept me in that circle of like eclecticism was just being on Last FM, because it was like it would recommend you, or like you would see other people listening to stuff. So like if I listened to Bon Iver, I would get recommended like Volcano Choir, or like, any other like more and more out psychedelic music. Um if I liked Radiohead, like I'd start getting recommended like more. And so I think that's kind of a part of it too. It's just like having friends, and then also Last FM.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Last FM, and you are the first person again that I've talked to that knows what that is. No, probably not knows what that is, but that I've talked
We
about.
did it. We were there.
Yeah, we were there. I want to back up a little bit to something you said about, I guess, your listening life prior to 14, and that's not just that you listen to classical music, but you listen to contemporary classical music. What were your entry point? Was that your parents doing, or how did you? Even as a composer and someone who loves contemporary classical music, I don't think I listened to that until I was like well into high school. You know what I mean?
Yeah. My entry point to it, I think, was just in some regards luck. When I was playing classical violin, but I also did fiddling. So I was doing kind of both, and I had a really wonderful violin teacher from age 5 to 11 named Etty Lucky, and she completely changed my life, because honestly she was very Ursula energy. Like, she
Yeah,
really had Ursula energy. Her way of like life and living was very like free form, and she lived in a beach house. And when I went there, it was kind of like my little oasis. But a big part of those lessons, and I should credit my mom, because my mom really didn't want me to do Suzuki, because she just felt like Suzuki wouldn't necessarily like nurture my passion, and she didn't want me to be stressed out at age 5. I was stressed out at age 5, but it wasn't necessarily her doing.
yeah,
um, and so Etty was more of a freeform kind of teacher. And so, like, just starting at 5, like, we would just like improvise on the instrument together. And so I had this opportunity of discovering a lot of sounds on the violin that, like, I don't think I would have otherwise. Like, we wrote this piece about Halloween, and I was like dragging my bow like across the instrument, and I was like knocking on the wood, and like just really exploring the instrument in a way that I think kind of prepared me to like get exposed to contemporary classical or like other types of sounds like much earlier, just because I was doing it on my own. Um, and so the first stuff I heard was probably like minimal, like Philip Glassy stuff, which I came to, just by people showing it to me. I went to like a music school, neighborhood music school. That was a pretty intense place to take lessons, full of a lot of, obviously I'm from Connecticut. It was full of a lot of people who wanted to go to Yale. And while I was there, it would just be playing. Like, there was just a lot of that kind of energy around Philip Glass, who's an artist who's had like so many collaborations with like mainstream music, that I think someone like that is kind of easier to come in contact with. And then later I played different trains. I know, I think I was like 15. And that introduced me to Reich, and Reich kind of introduced me to Coltrane, and then it was kind of like a whole rabbit hole through that era of minimalistic and like mood painting music. But it's interesting to me because so much of the discovery there was through playing.
Yeah. I think folks who work in the arts and had grown up playing an instrument like you and I have, there's always like a point where it's like, okay, I have to not necessarily I gave up on a playing existence.
Yeah,
I don't play my
yeah,
instrument
yeah.
anymore, and I'm happy about that, actually, so that I can compose and do radio and all this other stuff. So I'm sure there was a point where you had to decide the violin needs to take a back seat so that I can focus on my career as a journalist. What point did you decide that, and what point did you kind of put the violin on a back burner?
Yeah, I mean, when I was in high school, I did competitive violin playing, like regionals, all state. My junior year, I was like the top scorer in my county or whatever region. And I hated that. Like, I really didn't connect with being so competitive. It's not my way of like living.
Oh, same way. I was first chair in all-state band my senior
So you
year,
get it.
and I like, it was just like, oh, cool. But
You're like,
I hate competing, so it was weird.
and then you're around all these other people who are like, I need the seat, I need the seat. And you're like,
Yep.
chill. I'm just here.
Yeah, I was being coached by like the dude in third chair. I was like, what? Like, back off, dude. Like,
The drama.
yeah,
Oh,
right.
it's a whole other conversation, but the
Yeah,
drama at the regional and the all state orchestra is unreal. It's like too much. But I remember just thinking I love so much music that is not classical music. I was probably like 17 when I started thinking this, and like I was kind of on the path to do music school or to do music performance. But I kept thinking to myself, if like my favorite artists were Radiohead, Bon Iver, Wilco, and like I don't even know what would my fourth have been, like Michelle Branch. It's like, do I want to be a classical violinist? It was something that I really struggled a lot with at that age where I just felt so much confusion. And so actually the first year of college, like I didn't even touch my instrument. Really. Like I did not the Yale Symphony, but like they had like a college orchestras. They're basically in the dorm, and I did one of those, but I didn't really go very often. And I just was like, I'm going to define myself not as a musician anymore and not through music. I'm also really good at like math and thinking and things like that. And so I kind of took that path. But one thing that always remained was that I was passionate about music theory and history. And I loved it. And I loved it through high school. Like I took AP music theory through this music school I went to. And I loved music history. And I continued doing that even my first year of school, of college. I took music theory and it just sucked me back in. And so then I did the symphony orchestra, I did lessons, I did all of it, and continued taking music theory and history. And I think through that experience, what I learned is the thing that ties me to music is just my interest in context and sort of grounding it versus playing it. And so doing like college radio was like a way to really just talk about music with people and to sort of get into that scene. And I think a lot of folks who do like what I do probably did college radio.
yeah,
Like it's just so formative. And I just knew that like I didn't want to perform. Like where I was best was talking about music. It wasn't and trying to understand it and understand why it matters. And it was never really like making it myself.
yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought up the college radio thing, because that's something we share in common, but it's something we've never talked about. So I'd love to talk
Oh my
about it a
God.
little more and see,
Yes.
like, compare our experiences. And at what point in college did you start doing that? What kind of stuff did you do? I just want to hear
Yeah.
about it.
So, one thing about me that I try not to make obvious, but people who know me know this. I'm shy. Like, I'm shy, and I have very introverted moments where I'm like, I cannot be around anyone. So the context for that is just that like I signed up to join college radio like my first day of undergrad, and
Me too. Yep.
and then I didn't do it because I was too nervous because so at Yale the radio station is technically not on campus, or at the time it was like further off campus. They've moved since then, and it's like an affiliated organization, but it's not like one of the clubs of the school basically. And so I was really afraid to go there. I was like, what's going to happen if I go? So then a few of my friends joined second semester, and I saw them having a lot of fun, and I was kind of like jealous. So finally my sophomore year I joined and I started. And I had a show with one of my best friends from undergrad where we did a lot of talking about indie music. We were hanging out the other week, and she reminded me that our first episode was roasting Pablo Honey.
The first Radiohead album, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, the two of us, she's also a critic. And I think the two of us kind of had this show where we would just like talk about music together and play a lot of like indie stuff. And then I also had a show on my own where I played the concept for the show was like pop music that's influenced by contemporary classical. So like I would play like Become Ocean and then like something ambient. You know what I mean? Like it was kind of that idea. Or like Velvet Underground, like things like that. Just to show something I was really passionate about at the time. I care less about it now, but at the time I was really passionate about the fact that like experimental music doesn't live in a bubble and very much has influence outside of the circle. And so I really just wanted to show people that. And that show was called Classic. And it was really fun. The playlists are still on my Spotify. I
Oh,
just
awesome.
learned. And I
I'd
haven't
love
looked
to
it
check
up.
those out.
But that was kind of and I was co music director with two other people. I think the taste kind of there was we were very into like what was in like 2016.
Was this a radio station with like a unified sound, or was it more like a community college radio station where like every hour a student got to kind of do their own thing? Because the station I started at in undergrad was very much like very structured NPR classical music. It was like a very structured format, very journalism heavy kind of newsroom work. And I'm really bummed out that I never got to be a part of like a community radio station where I could just do whatever I wanted. There's a radio station in Lexington, Kentucky that I love that I'll shout out. I feel compelled to shout out. It's WRFL. And if you just
Hmm.
go every semester, they have a different schedule because it's like students doing their own thing,
Yes.
and they have the craziest program titles.
Love it.
I absolutely love them. You can turn it on in the middle of the day, and it's like country western or like dance,
Love
like
it.
EDM music. It doesn't make sense, and I love that about that station. Was it like so? Anyway, just a
Yeah.
tangent to ask you, what was your station like?
It was the latter. It was you could do whatever you wanted. And like some people had talk shows, like there were dating shows and things. There were also obviously music shows, and we were online. So we didn't have to follow FCC rules. It was really just whatever. And we had this chat, and I'll never forget. I had like 7 weekly listeners, like 5 to 7. But there was this random person who listened every week from Italy. And I don't know who it was, but it really like meant something to me that I could like just be chatting with like these people who were listening. And I had like one fan who listened every week and would be like, "Oh, I was just listening to Schoenberg." And I'd be like, "How's the 12 tone?" And it had a real, so it was community radio, and it also had a community spirit, I think is what I'm trying to say. Like we partnered a lot with like this local music venue, which at the time was new, now is not new. College Street Music Hall. They do like most of the big indie shows that come through New Haven. Like I've seen like Slow Dive there. You know, we went to this amazing Dinosaur Jr. and Cloud
Oh,
Nothings show.
that's awesome.
Yeah, so Built to Spill, like it was those kinds of bands, and we would partner with them and go for free. And that was I loved that. That was such a great perk. But it was very like, you know, we also hosted our own shows. We had like this anti-fling festival every year, which was sort of like anti-spring fling, which was like the mainstream music festival. So, you know, there was a real community behind it, but I would say it was a specific type of person who was involved. Like it was very like indie focused and indie forward. And at the time that was like Mitski pre-fame.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Like Mitski played Anti-Fling, which is
That's
kind of a
awesome.
crazy thought of just her with the drummer. And you know, like Speedy Ortiz, like Frankie Cosmos, like that sort of era of indie porches. And you know, it was like really formative for me intellectually, but also just like in terms of finding a music community of people who were interested in stuff that maybe wasn't what everyone was interested in. Now it's kind of weird to talk about because everyone loves Mitski, but at the
Yeah.
time, it
Well,
was like, you know.
as a sidebar, and I might edit this out because it might be TMI, but we're going to see Mitski in Cleveland in September.
Yes,
And
uh-huh.
that's our first Mitski. It'll be our first Mitski show. And we had to like enter a lottery. I entered the lottery for Cleveland and Detroit
So
because it's like the
wild.
same distance. And then like you have like 37 seconds to get your tickets once you get the link. And it's like, what is going on?
It's
Like,
wild.
I love Mitski. Her music's amazing, but
Hmm.
how does she sell out her shows worldwide at big venues instantly? It doesn't make sense to me.
No, it's something I think about a lot because, you know, with her specifically, she was such an emblem of this sort of underground that I was part of when I was like
Right, right.
18, 19. That I'm like amazed that her music now resonates with such a large audience. But at the same time, I was talking to a friend of mine who's very smart, and he was saying like he's not surprised by Mitski's trajectory, which I was like blown away by because for me it's shocking. But he was like, no, it's like she just has more money to do what she's always wanted to do. And I was like, that's kind of a good point. You know, so right now she has like the money to do like a whole production. It'll be interesting for you because you've been a fan to see her at this level of like performance where she's really doing the whole theatrical thing. It's so different than seeing her just kind of like do a DIY show at the Space in Hamden, which is like a basically a glorified basement. The other big one for me too at that time was Alex G, who's also huge now. He's like
Yeah.
on a main major
r-
label, right?
Right.
Like what? And both of those artists, it intrigues me that they have reached the audience they've reached because they're both, I'd say, pretty experimental with what they do. It kind of gives me hope. I'm like, people are more curious than we give them credit for.
Right, right. That's the biggest takeaway, I think. So you're doing this college radio station. Is your major like the major you're doing, is that adjacent to that kind of stuff? And I guess on that note, when was your first encounter with an arts journalist in real life?
In real life, wow,
Yeah.
that one's tough.
Okay,
But
I'll go with online too.
online, I'm going to be honest, it was the Kid A review in Pitchfork. The I started reading Pitchfork when I discovered Radiohead, and reading the Kid A review, which I maybe saw as a meme before anything, but that was my first interaction with arts criticism. And I was just like, what is going on here? This is terrible. But I was kind of addicted to it. And then I became like a daily Pitchfork
Yeah.
reader, you know? So my first in person encounter with an arts journalist was I took a music journalism class in undergrad with someone who, you know, wrote about the arts. And the class was not great, but it did introduce me to things that I do now. So I'm really thankful for that. But I was one of 3 women in the class. And so it was very much like a dudes yelling about music kind of vibe. And I would get in there and like try to be part of the argument. But I was like, I don't know if I love this. I
Yeah.
really don't know if I love this. And that made me kind of nervous about music criticism because I didn't really see myself represented, especially not in like what I write about, you know? And so I was like, where do I fit? But I think from that point forward, I just decided I'm going to fit and I'm going to do this. And whatever, you can think whatever you want, you know? And so, in some ways, that class was very formative. I also interviewed the guitarist Gigi, who you might know. I had the luck of connecting with her through a friend at YSM, and I interviewed her, and that was my first ever artist interview. So,
Oh, that's great.
yeah, so it kind of like put me on this path in a lot of ways, but was also a class where I was like, oh, this energy, I don't know, like, who am I in this space? And how do I sort of carve my own niche for myself as like a woman doing this? Because it's really not, it wasn't common. I think there's a lot of efforts now to bring in more like different voices to music criticism, but it's tough. And I will also say I was not a journalism major or a criticism major, anything in college. I did half of my college as a math, philosophy, and music major, had like a breakdown. And then then, and then, because of course,
Yeah, that's a lot.
it's too much. I was like really overachieving in my like teen years. So I had this breakdown and I just took an economics major. And so that has been how I've been able to like get day jobs like in arts administration, is just because I kind of have like a wide variety of skills. And to be honest with you, economics is one of the easiest majors you can get from Yale. So it was like, what can I do in 2 years?
Yeah. My undergrad major was music, but it was like the general music degree where you had to have a minor to go with it. So I chose business. Like, I'm probably going to need some business skills as a
Right.
musician.
You're just like,
And I
whatever.
will admit on the record that I took economics classes over the summer, put as little effort into them as possible. They were online classes and passed with flying colors. So
That's it, right.
I'll corroborate with you.
It's what you do when you have to just do, you know. I like started college at 17. So I was not prepared for it at all. And you do what you have to do to make it through age 17 to 21. And so, you know, I'm just really thankful that I was able to kind of discover this whole world while I was there, you know?
So you started your blog, The Road to Sound, as a place for, and I'm going to quote you here, discussing sounds that are mind boggling, fascinating, creative, surprising, fun, new, abstract, harmonic, atonal, and everything in between. And I'm reading that
Mhm.
verbatim because I love it. So to me, you're carving out a very special and specific niche to talk about the music that you love. So I'm just wondering, what is the importance of this space to you and to other people for that matter?
You know, when I started, so the first thing I did when I moved to New York was I interned at WNYC at WQXR. While I was there, like I was doing some writing, but it was not getting published, or like, you know, it just wasn't really working out, because it's hard when you're an intern. And so I just met with a few of my friends who are also interns at WNYC, and they were like, when are you going to do your own thing? Just start your own blog, just do it. And so that's why I started it. And at first it was like I just kind of wrote about stuff I saw in New York or things I heard and liked. And for me, it was just like a space to kind of explore what I was doing here in the city. And then when I went to Bang on a Can, and that was in 2019, I met Will Robin, the writer academic. He's so great, and he encouraged me to turn my blog into a thing. He's like, why not? Because he kind of got into this whole world by blogging as well as Seated Ovation, right? And so, I followed his advice. He was like, why don't you interview your friends? Like, why don't, just start reviewing things, and you have interesting something to say, like a voice, and say it. And so I kind of just started connecting with artists, and that's really where it, for me, what I felt like it was doing when it became this and wasn't just like mine, was that it was a place where I could really connect with artists and like make bonds with them and really write about their work in a way that was representative of what they were doing. Because I think a big issue in criticism has always been writers who don't take into account what the artist's voice is. And like, you can hate something, but coming from a place of understanding why it was made, I think is the key to writing a piece that's not just like hating, but is a thoughtful critique. And so for me, that is really what the Road to Sound became, was a place where I could really write about art like the way that I wanted to, and write about people the way that I wanted to write about people. And for audiences, I hope it's a place where they can discover all of these sounds and things, because I'm really lucky to be in New York where a lot of these people are, and I can sort of talk about what they do.
Have you experienced any surprises through your blog? And by that I mean, maybe surprises in people reaching out to you and giving feedback, or surprises in the kinds of artists you've been able to interview, or the music that
Yeah.
you've discovered through the doing this blog, just kind of a broad question there, I guess.
Yeah, so many, to be honest. Positively, I was surprised that Galia Baisangalieva was willing to be interviewed by me, because I'm a huge fan, like as a violinist, I'm a huge fan of her work and have been for many, many years. As a violinist, and also like a Paul Thomas Anderson fan, and also a Johnny Greenwood like stan.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, this is no way.
Yeah.
I think the other positive, like big surprise from the Road to Sound is just like that all of everything else has happened. Because I don't think anything that I've done would have happened without the blog. So like I would not have written for Pitchfork like without the blog. I would say that I like am part of the Tone Glow community. I don't know like if you read the newsletter, but yeah, like all of those writers who I've come in contact through writing for that newsletter probably would not have come in contact with without having my blog. Steve Smith's like another great mentor for me, and I feel like I connected with him not only because I worked at National Sawdust and like met him there, but because I blogged. So for me as a person, like that's been surprising that anything came of it. Because when I started it, it really truly was just like I'm seeing all this deep listening and like I want to write about it. You know what I mean? And I think there are people who want to read it, maybe. And then it just kind of became something a lot more, with a lot more reach. The negatives were that I've had to come into contact with, or to come to terms with, ethical concerns, and also people hating what I do. Like, the blog is the thing I get the most complaints on, believe it or not. Like, when I write a Pitchfork review, for the most part, people are just like, wow, someone wrote about this. Although I did get some intense complaints for a Nils Fromm review, but that's fine.
Oh, interesting. I
I
love his
know.
music.
No, it's funny because it's always like ambient fans, and I don't want to relaunch the ambient discourse, but it's always just like ambient music brings out the haters, people who are mad. But like I think, I get a lot of people who fill out my contact form who are like, actually it's this, or like trying to correct. it's something I've really had to build up a wall about. And part of the reason I left the blog for a minute was just because I had to deal with my own feelings about people not liking what I was doing and realize that it's them, not me, which I'm sure you also encountered doing radio because people
Oh, yeah. Classical
complain.
music radio listeners have opinions and they'll let you know about it. And that could be as simple as like, I accidentally said a dead composer's name incorrectly, or my favorite my favorite negative feedback I've gotten. I was playing this really amazing Tyler Braxton piece that was recently released called Telekinesis,
Oh, yeah, yeah, I know that
which
piece.
is like orchestra and choir and electronics. And my rule of thumb with my radio show is, as long as I can draw a thread between like the instrumentation, for example, that this composer is writing within, back to like what we normally would play like a Beethoven symphony, right? So I thought this piece was like, it was challenging, it was long, but it was really killer. I mean, it was an amazing piece, and anytime I come across a piece like that, I try to convey my own enthusiasm on air, just to like open people up to it. And it was like, this is like what Stravinsky would write for the Rite of Spring. I mean, there's a lot. I heard a lot of the Rite of Spring in this piece, which of course started a riot. Allegedly, I think there's some anyway.
The lore
The
says.
lore says that Stravinsky started a riot with the Rite of Spring. But anyway, this Chande Braxton piece, I hear a lot of Rite of Spring in it, and so I was like, this is like what Stravinsky would write, I think, if he had the tools that we have today. This listener wrote to me and she said, I always love listening to your show, but last night you played this piece that sent my cats running and hiding, and I had to turn it off. And I'm like, I always try to respond in kindness to even really brutal messages, and just be like, this is why I do what I do. This is why I think it's important. And, I totally understand that you might not like this or enjoy this, but my goal is to share the whole spectrum of what's out there. So keep listening. You might come across something that you like. And, conversely, I've gotten messages from listeners along the lines of, I used to be afraid of this music. That's their language. They said, I used to be scared of this music, and because of what you do, you've opened my mind and my heart to it. And so it's like, yeah, there's people who are willing to like go after you, certainly, but there's also people, I think most of the people who you don't hear from are really loving it, probably. I hope.
That's what you have to remember. And but like sometimes the hate is loud.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
On the point of ethics too, like I think, obviously I am friends with a lot of musicians, and I began sort of questioning like how can I write about people critically that I'm extra close with, and will they accept it if I don't write about them, right? Like I think for me there was a question of like, is our relationships transactional or are they for real? In the last couple of years, maybe have noticed I've written a lot about just like older people for larger publications because one, I'm interested in history, but two, because there's just no ethical issue. Like, if I want to write
Sure.
about Radigue, like, I'm not ever going to come in contact with her. We're not friends. I can have a really like clear opinion on it, but it can be hard. And I think a lot of people feel that if you're a music critic, especially in experimental music, you should be uplifting like really small artists and like getting them in Pitchfork and whatever. But I don't necessarily view my role to be like taste making or like making an artist blow up because I don't think I have that much power, and I just don't believe in that for myself. Like for me it's more about writing a piece of work that is interesting to read and hopefully educational than it's ever been about like taste making. And I think making those decisions for myself started with the blog, and that's been hard. Just to be honest, it's been hard because I think it's not how everyone views their work as a writer, but I know it's kind of what my work really is, especially because I feel the most connected to the music community in personally. So I have to be friends with it. I'm not going to not be friends with those
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. People ask me, how do you find so much of the music that you play on the radio show? And my answer is always like, well, they're my friends. and
Yes.
if I don't actually know this person and then I like really love their music and I connect with them and it's like they become my friends. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
you go to these shows and things, like the audience is full of musicians or people in the industry or people who are connected to this work in some way. And I think as a writer, if you're comfortable completely disconnecting from that, go for it. But that's just not, I don't think that's who I am. Like, I don't think I'm someone who's necessarily like willing to just let that community go. And especially because I started, like, honestly, because so much of this happened around me going to Bang on a Can, where I necessarily met a lot of artists. So, I think the road to sound has kind of been for me like the battleground of those ethical concerns inside. And I'm thankful for that because you got to think about it somewhere. But it isn't it isn't easy.
Maybe you just answered part of my next question, but this is a question I've asked everybody and will continue to ask everybody, but you're the first, again, non-composer that I've asked this question to. So I'm really
Mhm.
excited to hear your answer. But what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think for me, listening is the foundation, obviously, but really listening and not just hearing. I am an intensive and obsessive listener, which is maybe not like I don't know if it's good or not. I will listen to like one album all day and then I can really understand it deeply. And I think that is also something I've kind of just made my peace with, is that I'm never going to be like extensive in terms of like my knowledge or interests or anything. Like, I'm an intensive person. Like, I just have passions about certain things, certain artists, and I just will like really go in there. So listening is like the most important thing for me in terms of like my creative practice, and I do it every day. I listen to something new. Sometimes it's something new that's old too.
Yeah, sure.
Like
New to
I
you.
yeah, like I've started this thing this year where I'm listening to stuff that I'm embarrassed I have never heard. And it's been really great. Like, I listened to Jagged Little Pill for the first time.
I love that album.
I
You
didn't
were just,
know it.
I was talking about it the other day. It's funny.
No, it's such a good album. But like, I've heard Alanis's hits, but I never listened to the album front to back. Like, I just never did. And I was like, you almost get to this point where you're like, am I too old to listen to this? Like, but no, you're never too old to discover something or learn something. What else did I listened to Neutral Milk Hotel the other day too. I'd never listened to, yeah. So there's like a few things. I got the National on the docket. There's just some things that I've missed by nature of being like an intensive listener. Yeah, so that's like the number one thing. And then I think in terms of writing, a big thing for me is walking, which might be surprising, but I think walking is writing. Like, when I'm out on my walks, I walk a lot. And when I'm out on my walks, it's when I do my thinking and my processing and my understanding of what the creative practice will look like. What is the review going to be? And a lot of times I'll like write stuff down in my notes app while I'm out. And then the third thing is just trying my best to use a thesaurus.
Yeah.
The way my brain works is like using the same. I mean, obviously, I love minimalism. Obviously, I love drone. And it's kind of because that's how my brain works, is like coming back to the same ideas, coming back to the same words. And so I love a little repetition in my writing. Most editors do not love that. So I I really try to like make sure that I'm like varying my style and thinking about writing as like a rhythmic practice, stylistic practice, as well as getting the ideas across.
Yeah. I feel that because as someone who all of my writing is verbal writing, like it goes, people listen to it instead of reading it. And in that case, I don't think anyone's ever told me this explicitly, but I've kind of picked up over the years that repetition is a good thing. You know, you need to repeat stuff to listeners because, and in doing these interviews, even, and we were talking a little bit before this started about editing processes and post production. And I'll be listening to it over and over and over again, you know, cleaning things up and tightening things up. And I'm like, well, this person I'm talking to is being a little repetitive. Should I take that out? And it's like, no, because someone might miss that in the moment that they say it the first time and then catch it again. So it's interesting to hear you talk about the inverse of that.
Yeah. Well, and I think so much of what makes like an essay good, because criticism is really essay writing, and so much of what makes an essay good is like pace and variation and like knowing when to write a good sentence. Like last summer I was at the National Critics Institute, and it was really fun to just read all the critics like rhythmically. Like what is their pace, and like, you know, how do they end a paragraph? Really, how much repetition are they doing? I think it's so interesting because in an essay, like a repetition of an idea can be really valuable, but like the repetition of words, it's like, don't go there. Just, it's almost never going to work the way you think it will in your head. I think every single Pitchfork review that I draft and submit, I have a repetition situation, and every time the editor is like, it's not working.
Yeah.
Because it just doesn't, but you're totally right. In spoken word, it's like you gotta say something 3 times for it to
Yeah.
get through. And I don't know why it's so different, but it is. They're really different mediums
Yeah.
in some ways.
Yeah. I feel like this might be potentially overwhelming, but I'm going to go there. What is a piece of music or a song or a book, a piece of art, anything like that, that kind of changed in a dramatic way, changed your life, but maybe also just changed the way that you thought about your work, or just kind of keep it broad, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I think at different points in time, different pieces of art have really changed the way that I interact with the world, or like think about the world, or like hit me because of where I'm at. So I guess I'll name a few. For me in high school, I had the privilege of premiering with the Greater New Haven Youth Orchestra an Ingram Marshall piece. And playing that music struck a chord with me in a way that like no other music has really. And it was very, I would say the piece really was drone oriented, and so that was an early sign of like a lot of my taste that I think I have now. But I was the only kid in orchestra who was into it. Everyone else was like, why are we playing this new music? And I was like, it's so good, guys. Like it hits like so hard. But I really just felt that piece in my soul, and just I don't think I got to play a lot of music that I felt so deeply in my soul when I was a kid, because I just didn't connect to classical in that way. So that was one that really changed my life. And I also think kind of opened up a lot in terms of my own taste of like
Sure.
what I would get into. But obviously, Ingram Marshall's kind of part of the whole scene of a lot of composers I've written about. So it's like, it was almost like this little inkling of what would happen 12 years later, I guess. So that was a big moment. A more recent moment for me of a piece of art that I was just like really struck by, and that really kind of opened my eyes, was the film Cold War. Have you seen it? Cold War is like a pretty, it's like 80 minutes. It's a black and white, like Polish filmmaker about a couple in Poland throughout like the Cold War, kind of coming to terms with like political issues, war exiles, you know, the things that were going on in Eastern Europe after World War II. And the story is told, they're both musicians. And so a lot of the story and like the sort of tension between these two characters is told through music. So like there's a lot of folk and sort of like the folk aspect of Eastern Europe and like what that represents politically. There's like jazz in France. Like there's just
Yeah.
a lot of sort of, you know, it's sort of like told through the music. That time period is sort of told through the music, and it's beautifully shot. It's all black and white. And I just loved the idea of a film being told using like music as a way to talk about like the politics and the social aspect of the time. Obviously, I'm also Ukrainian, so like a lot of times like I do like Eastern European art or things about Eastern Europe in general. But I just like this film really struck a chord with me, and I found it to be very inspiring, almost like as a writer, because I think I wish in my ideal world I could write more about sort of like the politic in music. There's not like a lot of space for that anymore, but you know, I think seeing this film really, I really connected with it. And I was like, I want to write this way and I want to write about this and, you know, think about the world through the art that we consume.
You've kind of hinted at some of this throughout our conversation already, but I'd like to discuss curiosity in general because you seem to have a really good sense of that. So maybe discuss your own sense of curiosity in your work and in your life, and why maybe you think that curiosity is an important quality for all artists. Because I feel like not everyone is curious, and that for me personally, that can be frustrating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's super frustrating. I mean, I would say it's really hard for me to think about the world without being curious because I've always been someone who's pretty like open-minded and just down for whatever and kind of down to explore. But I think it's really key, especially for music writing, to be curious because there's a pull to wanting the clout of writing about whatever's popular. There's a real pull for that, you know, because if you write about, you know, tortured poets society and you give it a 10 or you give it a 2, like you will be getting engagement, you know. And yes, a lot of people have a lot of smart things to say about an album like that. I'm not discrediting that. But I think to be curious in your listening and in what you write about is actually way more rewarding, even if less people are reading it, because you'll end up getting to learn more. And it's just so important. Like you might start to see and have more unique takes on mainstream art if you're willing to like go and learn about things you never thought you'd need to learn about. And so I think with music writing, that's sort of the key, is this sort of curiosity for discovery. Even if you like me and you're an intensive listener, you still have to be curious to go through the artist's like whole discography or to listen to an album for 12 hours and really just wonder what's happening musically on it and why. I think that that curiosity is what leads to opinions that are, you know, your own truly, and like leads you to finding your own voice, which I think is what we're all looking for when we make something.
Yeah. As opposed to, I think this is good. I like this
Yeah.
because someone told me that this is what I learned. Right.
Yeah. Exactly. Or, you know, just repeating like the mainstream conversation online because like in criticism we do kind of contend with what's being spoken about already online, and it's easy to just soak in those takes and then write something that just synthesizes what's already out there, but it's way more fun to say something that no one else thought of.
Yeah. Is there a difference in the way that you approach writing about the different kinds of music that you're interested in? Let's say an album of contemporary string quartet music versus a review of an ambient noise show,
Mm-hmm.
kind of two very different things.
Mm-hmm. It's also kind of publication dependent. I think the best classical reviews do really talk about, or I'm just saying classical for like a quartet, kind of in that vein, really do get into like the musical aspects of the piece and like what's going on and how the players are interacting with each other and engaging with each other. Like that's really important, especially if it's like a premiere or a new work. And I think there's that element of it needs to be there. But I would say for like a lot of ambient and noise, it's all about the experience. A lot of that music isn't even about listening to it. It's about what happens when you're in the room and how you feel and who's there and the conversations you have. I was just at End Times like a month ago, which is a noise festival here in New York. And every time I go, like half of the experience is really just seeing who's there at 8 p.m. and who's there at 3 a.m. Like, how has the room changed? And what did I hear? Like, a lot of times, the sets there are like, I'm just using this as an example, but the sets are like 20 minutes and they're all over the noise range. Like, you might get people who are noise from like a free improv background versus people who are doing like harsh noise or like synth stuff. Like, it's all happening. Like, there's just a lot of different things at end times, and that's really exciting. And so talking about that variation is really important, I think, and it's less about like what was good and what was bad and more about like what happened and was being in that space good. And then I think when it comes to really talking about a piece of music, I do come to it from a theoretical perspective, or like I try to. Like I always ask composers for their scores if they send me stuff.
That's
So,
awesome.
because I want to know. And there are some composers who write really fun scores, like Scott Walschlager. His scores are so fun. So it's like, of course, I'm going to want to see it, if I'm like listening to a piece. And yeah, and I think in some ways that's a little bit why like contemporary classical writing kind of stays in a little bubble because it is such a different form than maybe writing about something that's a little bit more free, you know? But I never want to sacrifice talking about the art and meeting the art at where it's at.
Yeah, I guess I've never thought about this before, but is looking at scores a common practice? Because not to go on a tangent or tirade here, but I rely heavily on program notes for my radio shows, so I can, I would rather take what an artist has written and craft that for the radio to tell their story than just to listen to the music and figure it out on my own and maybe present something that's not
Right?
intended.
Right?
And a lot of people don't write program notes, which I think people should, even if it's just a little, three sentences or whatever. Like I was inspired by this, or this piece is trying to do this. But in cases where I can't find program notes, I have turned to the score and I'll look at the notes on the score, like the description on a tempo marking, or there's this gesture in the clarinet. So I'm going to talk about that, and this is what it looks like on the page, and try to put it into radio speak. Do a lot of critics do that, or do you find that that's like a you thing, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do not have to read music to be a critic. Like, it's all about how you approach your work, you know? So I think it's super dependent. Most of the classical critics that I'm in contact with do use the score or like will have a score at like a rehearsal or really go in there because I think it's important to have that understanding. But one thing I will say that I think all critics need to do is not read PR. Like listen to the download, but don't read the bio because before you listen. If you want to read the bio to like fact check or like make sure you're like in a similar, you're sort of getting what they're trying to do, great. But PR, love them. I have so many friends in PR, but they're feeding a narrative. And the key for criticism is to not just push the narrative, but understand the context of the work in conversation with the
Yeah.
world. And so with classical, for me, a lot of times that comes from the score, because the score, there's like such a history of notation. And I think the score, the way a composer writes a score, is in conversation with how other people have composed, you know? And so to me, it's really important to see that. But like for something that isn't scored, I'm like, I will not be reading your narrative other than like the factual parts, because I think I have to have my own thoughts about what this means and is.
What do you think most people get wrong or even right? What do you think most people get wrong or right about experimental music, the kind of music that you are most attracted to?
Hmm. I think a lot of people think drone is boring, and I think they're wrong. And that nothing
Yeah.
happens. I think they're totally wrong. And on that point, I think a lot of people think drone is easy listening, but I actually think it's the hardest listening you can do. Like, because you have to be focused to really get something out of it and to hear the minutia that's happening in like a sound or just like a note. You really have to be focused in a way that like you don't have to be focused if you're just hearing a banger. Like, and I think that by feeding this idea that like ambient is easy listening, drone is easy listening, we're like not allowing people the space to really grapple with the difficult moments in this work. And so I really get frustrated by that. Somebody called Radigue, I won't say who, I won't say what, but somebody called Radigue easy listening, and I had like a
Oh.
like a breakdown. I was like, there's no way that anybody on earth thinks Radigue is easy listening. Like, it is, you're missing the whole idea of it, which is that by focusing on this music, you can have like an elevated experience of presence and of life. And I think that really goes misunderstood a lot. And it's also, to me, it's not boring when you listen in that way, because it's not just like room sound, it becomes something to immerse in.
Yeah, I think the moment for me where I started thinking about drone specifically in a different way, I was taking a an electronic music class in grad school where we wrote electronic music, right? And I had never done anything like that until I got to grad school. So it was my first semester. We had this assignment to produce a fixed media piece, and so I'm just in Logic playing with synthesizer sounds, and
Yeah.
I'm kind of like very childlike, messing around, not really knowing what I'm doing, sandbox style. And my kind of go-to, I don't know if it's a crutch. It felt like a crutch, but I think it's actually a legitimate way of working. It was to just like produce a ton, like just hit record and record a ton of stuff, like 30 minutes worth of stuff. And I came into class the next day with this like 11-minute piece thing that I'd put together, and there was an extended drone sound in the middle. I was just like, I'm just gonna hold down the button and then like play around with the
Yeah.
modular synth stuff. And I just thought it was just like making stuff up, like not serious, just see what happened. And we listened to it in class the next day, and my teacher was like, he was just kind of like quietly nodding, and the piece ends, and he's like, yeah, I think you're done. And he's like, that section in the middle with the drone, he's like, I could listen to that all day. And I'm like, what? Really?
No way.
And I guess like a lot of people on this podcast talk about getting permission to pursue stuff they want to pursue. And I think for me, that was a moment of getting permission to like okay, I can make this music and I can make it this way and it's legitimate. And now, yeah, I think because of that simple act of like, yeah, this is good from my teacher at the time has enabled me to listen to that kind of music in a different way as well, not just make it.
Yeah, and it's so true getting permission, especially in the classical world where it feels like breaking a rule could end your life
Yeah.
for real.
Yeah.
You're like, "Oh my gosh, like no wait, there's this whole universe to explore. Like there are all these avenues that I can still like check out and it's okay."
So you've written for a lot of important publications. You've mentioned Pitchfork already, but also just to name a few, there's Bandcamp Daily, WNYC's New Sounds. Again, that's just a few. There's a whole list on your website. How did you cultivate relationships with these publications, and what has your experience been like writing for them?
Well, a big thing you have to get over, or I had to get over when I was doing this, is just being afraid of like cold emailing, because so many of these relationships came from cold emailing. The biggest one is The Wire. Like um and I'm forever indebted to Joshua Minsu Kim for this, because I would never have pitched The Wire, but we were chatting and he was like, "You should just go pitch The Wire. Why are you not doing it already?" I pitched them and they got back to me right away. And I just became an album reviewer for them.
Oh, that's awesome.
And yeah, and I think, but as someone who is shy and who is mostly introverted, it's scary to cold email and to like try to establish any sort of relationship. Like, I'm not really a networker. Like, that's not really how I roll. But I think, I just am at this point where if I believe in the idea enough, like I will apply. But almost all of it has been just by like putting myself out there and just like cold reaching out to people. Pitchfork happened because I applied to their fellowship and they interviewed me for it. I didn't end up getting it, but they were like, "Do you want to freelance?" And I was like, "Sure, I'll freelance." And then that sort of started our relationship, which has been, I guess it's 4 years now. And Wire was a cold email. Bandcamp, I met an editor there through Tone Glow, who I, was able to work with there. And, Tone Glow, I've met a lot of people just by being part of that. But Joshua, knowing Joshua was like cold, he just DM'd me. He read something on my blog and was like, "You're a good writer." And I was like, "Thanks. Cool." And then kind of became part of this whole community that has really changed my life. So I think a huge part of it, and this is hard for people like me who are like on the shyer side, is just kind of being open to life and the possibilities of life and the people who want to talk to you and like who you maybe want to talk to. It's like you got to get over yourself and just do it, even if it's terrifying.
I'm just curious to know this kind of for myself, and I'm sure others will appreciate your answer to this too. But what's something that you're listening to right now that was like a big time discovery for you, or even just a surprise? Who might be an artist that other folks haven't heard of that you just want them to know about, like the music right now that you're listening to. You want to go to the rooftops and shout it as loud as possible.
Well, this album everyone's heard too much about, but Cindy Lee, Diamond Jubilee, I listened to for 3 weeks straight. That's like all I listened to. Before it blew up, I was listening to it. And the reason, I'll also give like a real recommendation, but the reason I was listening to this album was just because like people around me were like, "Oh, Cindy Lee." And I had like tried some other Cindy Lee stuff. And to be honest with you, post punk can be very hit or miss for me. So a lot of like Pat's earlier things like Women, I was kind of like, I like some of the albums. I don't love some of the albums. Like, I don't know. Like, I know it, but I don't love it. And then Diamond Jubilee hit, and I was like, this is the greatest pop album I have ever heard in my life. And like lyrically, it relates a lot to a lot of the sort of feelings I've had recently, and it's a very like transitory album. Like I think so much of it is like the words that probably come up most on this album are like you, like dreams, truth is a big one, want, like that sort of like yearning and desire, but also like dreams and reality. Like what is the truth about people, what is the truth about yourself? Like I think those ideas, like the album really tries to explore. And so I was really just relating to it. And I straight up listened to that album for like 3 weeks. And then it blew up in a really just like unreal way. So that was truly like a big moment for me in March. And then my current like album of the year is this Armbruster record. Do you know Armbruster?
No, I don't.
He's a violinist. It's called Can I Sit Here? And it's like basically a noise album, but it's made with violin. It's like shoegaze, but like make it violins. Like you
Oh,
want
I
to
love that.
turn Kevin Shields' guitar into a violin. Like that's kind of the energy it's
Sweet.
giving, you know. And I'm just always really drawn to anyone who's going to experiment on an instrument like a violin that has so much history in it. Anyone who's going to take it and want to do something different, I'm like, let's go. But two, I just really love like a good noise or a good drone album. And I think this is kind of really giving that. And it's very emotional without having to say anything at all. Like it's just, you can really feel the grief, you can feel the joy, you can feel it all really just like in the tone of the instrument. And I love that. So that's my current like favorite album this year.
Yeah, I'll include a link to that on the show
Yeah,
notes. I
you
love seeing
should. People should check it out.
that. So kind of getting into the my closing questions here, and again, these are questions I've been asking everybody, and curious to hear your perspective on them. What do you think you'd be doing right now if it wasn't your art, if it wasn't writing about music or music at all in general?
It's scary to think about because it's so much of my life, but I would be doing something with my hands. Like I've always been really good with my hands. Like I'm really good at baking. I'm good at gardening. I'm really good at like embroidery and knitting and things that I learned from my Ukrainian grandma. And so I always thought like if I wasn't doing this, I would probably be doing something with my hands because it's the other thing I love to do.
I guess on that note, because writing can be tactile,
Mm-hmm.
do you write by hand much?
Sometimes I've written whole reviews by hand, yeah, but it's not as convenient as writing
Right.
like on my phone as if I'm like out. So I think there's something so cool about seeing the words in your handwriting because it feels more like you. To me, it's like then I'm seeing my voice on the page.
Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? And that could be a physical tool, it could be a thing that you do, anything.
You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say a thesaurus.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all people need to do.
I'll include a link to the Webster's thesaurus for this.
I'm telling it changes the thing, and the thing people need to thesaurus. We're gonna make it a verb. The thing people need to thesaurus is verbs, because it's so much easier in music writing to say this is this, but to activate it and animate it, you know, much harder. And a thesaurus can be really helpful for that.
Yeah. So my final question is your chance pretty much to say whatever you want, and that is, what's something that you've never had a chance to say about your writing, about the thing that you do, that you've always wanted to share with people?
Um, I think the key for me is something I maybe have already brought up in our conversation, but that it's just that I'm not doing this to like taste make at all, really, or to give people press or any of that. I'm doing it because I'm really fascinated by how art exists in our world and how like we experience the experience of experiencing art.
Yeah.
And I'm really really fascinated by like the communities and the worlds that are built around experimental music and the people who are part of them, more so than I am about what's cool, what's good, or what's next. And I think that that is like my primary motivating force, is just being really interested in art in context and meeting the people who are doing it.
Yeah. I love that. Well, Vanessa, I've got to say thank you so much for what you do for our community. We can't do what we do without you and folks like you. And thanks so much for sharing a little bit today. It's been fun.
Yeah, it's been really great, and thank you for composing. Like it's and having your show because you're doing it too on the air.
I'm trying.
And you know, like I think radio and writing are really in conversation with each other, and both under duress right now.
Yeah.
But very important because it's just like how people get to learn more about what's going on in this corner of the music world.
Yeah. We're going to keep doing it.
We're gonna, no matter what, we're
Yep.
here.
Yep. We're here. We're going to shout whether you like it or not.
Yep. Basically.
I've known Vanessa now for a handful of years, and it's always struck me how similar her work is to what I've been doing in the broadcast space, but also how wildly different it is, and so I really appreciate that little peek behind the curtain that she gave us today. Vanessa Ague is online at vanessakague.com. That's K as in K-A-Y, and then A-G-U-E, Vanessa K. Ague, all one word. And her blog, The Road to Sound, is at the roadtosound.com. And especially if you want to make some great musical discoveries, I highly encourage you to visit both of her websites. And I'll have links to those in the show notes for this episode. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We're online at looseleaftransmissions.com, and you can find more episodes of the podcast and ways to support us while you're there on the Loose Leaf Transmissions website. That's all I've got for you today. I'll see you next time, same place.